All right. Well, we are coming down to the wire. We got 3 classes left. And it looks like we're pretty well on schedule, so we will probably wrap this up. Last week, as you remember, we were talking about science in the Bible. We were talking about the age of the earth. And we saw there were actually many views on the age of the earth. And that from the biblical point of view, there are Christians who are solid, believing Christians who believe that the earth was very old, and there are those who believe it was very young, and there are at least 4 different views as to how that reconciles itself out in the biblical account. So whether you're old earth or young earth, that really shouldn't apply to whether you believe the Bible or don't believe the Bible. So that pretty much wraps up the external tests. As you remember, we said there are 3 types of tests when we come to reliability. There are the bibliographical tests, there are the external tests, and then there's the internal tests. And we've looked at the bibliographical, the text and transmission. We've looked at the external test, how it lines up with science and history and archaeology. That leaves the internal tests for things like internal consistency. And again, these are not unusual tests. These are not tests that are created just to demonstrate the reliability of the Bible. These are tests that are generally used whenever scholars come across an ancient document and they want to start looking at that document and will try to determine how reliable is this document. These are the same sorts of tests that they will use. So we're going to start with the internal tests. And the first one is the one you probably have heard of. It's basically a test for consistency. Is the Bible telling a consistent story? Or, put in different terms, does the Bible contradict itself? And the common view today is that the Bible is just full of contradictions. Of course you can't trust the Bible. Everybody knows it has contradictions in it. And whenever I have somebody tell me that, the first thing I do is I ask them, name one. And virtually none of the people I've asked, this may be just a couple of handful of people who, of the many who have told me that, have ever actually been able to give me a particular contradiction, or what they claim was a contradiction. So, we're going to take a look at some of the contradictions. There's actually a book put out by a skeptic of the 18th century that lists a whole bunch of contradictions. Most of them, you have to work hard to see a contradiction in them. Some of them are basically translational issues, things like that. But we're going to go through a number of alleged contradictions here and see whether they really stand up as contradictions or not. Now, first thing we have to talk about is, what is a contradiction? Because a lot of the things that are alleged to be contradictions in the Bible are not actually even contradictions in terms. Now, if you want to get really strictly philosophical about this, the contradiction is defined as, in terms of 2 statements that cannot both be true. And what we oftentimes think of a contradiction is actually what is called in logic a contrary. But we're going to just take the more loose definition of 2 statements that both cannot be true. Right? So, first off, does anyone here know of a contradiction? Or a claimed contradiction? No one? Well, I happen to have a handout. I know it's a surprise in this class that we have handouts. But I have a handout listing contradictions, or at least alleged contradictions. And these are all contradictions that I have either read in books or have had people tell me specifically that these are contradictions. These are not contradictions that I came up with because they're easy to answer, although they actually are. But I came up with these because these are a representative list of the contradictions that I have had people tell me. So, the first one, we look at Acts 9:7. It says, the men which journeyed with him, Paul, stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. Now, Paul's encounter on the road to Damascus. And then later on in Acts, Paul's recounting this. He says, and they that were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spoke to me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard the voice. So did they hear the voice or did they not hear the voice? Well, it depends on what you mean by hear. Have you ever been talking to somebody on the phone? Or even better yet, you're working, you're doing something, and someone calls over to you, and you turn to them and I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear you. What did you say? Why did you ask them that question if you couldn't hear them? How did you even know to turn and say, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you repeat the question? How did you know to do that?
You heard a noise, but it was the meaning of whatever it said.
You heard them, but you did not understand them. And the word to hear in English and in Greek can either mean to actually hear in terms of a level of sound, or to hear in terms of to understand. And what you have here is you have them, basically, you have them hearing but not understanding. And in fact, some of the modern translations take care of that. So, which translation do you have?
NIV, and it says understand.
Yeah. Because the word akuo, I hear, used with the genitive, if you want to get really kind of technical, means to understand. And so it's not that they guess, they actually translated that. So in some respects, this is somewhat of a translational issue, but it's really just an issue common to all languages. Because we can say, oh, I hear, or some of you might even tell me, you're not hearing me. When they really mean you're not understanding me. This next one was given to me by a college professor when I asked him, because he made the statement the Bible's full of contradictions, and I asked him to name one. And so he gave me this one. And this was in a class on the Bible at a secular university. And so this was the professor teaching about the Bible. I asked him for a contradiction, and he gave me one. Right? And to be really technically correct, although I don't think he was going this direction, he is correct. This is a contradiction. Well, let's read it. 1 Samuel 31, verses 4 and 5, it says, but his armor-bearer was terrified, talking about Saul. But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it, would not take Saul's life. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. We move over to 2 Samuel, and an Amalekite says, that Saul said, "Stand over me and kill me, for I am in the throes of death, but I am still alive." So I stood over him, and I killed him, because I knew that he had fallen, and he could not survive. So did Saul kill himself, or did an Amalekite kill him?
Could be both.
Yeah,
Could be both?
I get the sense that Saul started the process. He didn't, by falling on the sword, he started the process. And then maybe the armor bearer just finished it off because he couldn't stand the pain that he was in and finished him off.
But the armor bearer was not the Amalekite.
Oh, sorry, that's my mistake then, okay.
The Amalekite was somebody else, a third party.
Mhm.
So you have in the first statement, Saul fell on his sword, and when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell on his own sword and died.
So the armor bearer was after the
No,
Amalekite.
because Saul told the armor bearer to kill him, and the armor bearer wouldn't do it. So the armor bearer is there. Saul is there. The armor bearer asks Saul asked the armor bearer to kill him. The armor bearer will not do it, so Saul commits suicide
But he didn't finish it.
and died.
Oh.
And then the armor bearer committed suicide because he did not want to go on without his master. Move over to 2 Samuel, and you have an Amalekite who comes to David bearing the armor stuff of Saul and says, "I killed Saul."
So is he lying?
Was he lying?
Yes.
He was executed for it.
Yes. I've got a footnote here.
Oh, we got a
Oh,
cheated. He looked at the footnote.
The Amalekite story is at variance with the record of 1 Samuel and is clearly a fabrication.
Yeah.
You
But why would the
saw
Amalekite
recognition.
do that? I mean, David had him executed.
He was seeking recognition.
Yeah. Yes, he was seeking recognition. So technically, yes, this is a contradiction in the Bible. So if anyone ever says, is there a contradiction in the Bible? You can say yes. Because the biblical account of how Saul died and the biblical account of the Amalekite story, i.e. the Amalekite story, are in conflict. Both cannot be true. So in some respects, my instructor was correct. Although the impression he left in the class was that the Bible therefore could not be trusted. But that's an important part to remember. The Bible is faithfully recording the Amalekite's story, which is clearly false. If 1 Samuel was. The other thing to remember is 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel were originally just Samuel. We broke them up for size constraints. So the author of 1 Samuel is sitting there penning the account of how Saul died. And remember, there are no chapter divisions at this time. So right after penning the account of how Saul died, he goes on to recount how Amalekite tried to take credit for it. So, why would an Amalekite take credit for killing Saul if David was to have him killed for doing it? Because what was the relationship between Saul and David? Not good. In fact, Saul wanted David to be killed. So undoubtedly the Amalekite came across the body, took evidence of the death, and ran off to Saul's greatest enemy to take credit for killing him. But while Saul wanted David dead, David did not want Saul dead. And therefore he had the Amalekite executed. So the Amalekite really had a bad day.
So was he executed for lying or for
He was executed for,
Or did David truly believe he killed Saul?
he believed the Amalekite had him killed for it. And, you know, it's not exactly a modern court system where you got like 3 months of trials. This was kind of a, you know, at best a military tribunal, but wasn't even really that. This is the court system of the day. This was one came from a liberal scholar, and he was writing about how he was being somewhat sarcastic of a Catholic scholar for thinking that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. And as his evidence that this guy, how could this guy possibly believe Luke wrote it? Everybody knows that the author of Acts and the author of Luke, and you know, that the traveler with Paul, there's lots of contradictions there. And his footnoted contradiction to show this happens to be this next one. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. So all speak in tongues. 1 Corinthians 12:10, to another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different tongues, and still to another interpretations of tongues. Which clearly indicates that not all speak in tongues. So in Acts you have all speak in tongues. In 1 Corinthians you don't have all speaking in tongues. Only some people speak in tongues. Clearly, in this scholar's mind, a contradiction.
What happened in Acts was different from what happened with the distribution of the spiritual gifts.
Exactly. This is actually a logical fallacy of hasty generalization. You know, he takes from one particular statement in Acts about a very special event, Pentecost, unique in the history of the church. All spoke in tongues at Pentecost. Does that therefore mean all must speak in tongues throughout all the rest of church history? Of course not. And yet, this scholar was using this as an example to ridicule somebody for believing in the Gospel of Luke. So not only this is actually one of the more flimsy contradictions, but it actually is not that uncommon among supposedly the scholars of the Bible, at least the liberal scholars of the Bible. Because quite frankly, a lot of them have basically the same idea that you hear. Well, everybody knows it's full of contradictions. So when someone presents a contradiction like this, they really don't do the work, the due diligence that they should do to see if the claim is correct. Because what difference does it make? Even if this one's bad, well, we know there's a whole bunch more. Except as we go through these one by one, they just don't ever actually pan out as contradictions. Matthew chapter 20. And behold, two blind men sitting by the wayside, when they heard that Jesus passed by, cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. But in Luke it says, a certain blind man sat by the wayside begging, and cried out, Jesus, thou Son of God, or Son of David, have mercy on me. So was there two men or one?
Are both descriptions of the same event?
Yeah, they're both descriptions of the same event.
Okay.
Yeah, they are clearly the same event. So, were there two men there or one? There were two. Does that mean Luke's in contradiction with Matthew? Of course not. Whenever you write down anything, whenever you tell somebody about something, you must edit the details. Right? For example, if you're describing a crash at an intersection, is it necessary to specify the 5 cars that went through before without getting into it? If you don't mention them in your discussion of the crash, does it mean that they didn't exist? Of course not. You just didn't mention them. How many have ever heard about John F. Kennedy getting assassinated? Dallas, 22nd, 1963. You know. In all the accounts that happened, did they mention who else was shot that day? Some of them do, but did every single account mention the other people shot that day? Do you even know how many other people were shot that day by Oswald? And yes, it was Oswald. It was not a conspiracy. It was Oswald. He acted alone. I don't believe in any conspiracies. Not even that one. So, but let's set aside who did it for a moment. How many other people were shot by the person who shot John F. Kennedy? Two others.
People in the front seat.
What's that?
The people in the front seat.
Connolly was sitting in front of Kennedy and he was shot. And then there was Officer Tippit, who was shot during the arrest of Oswald in the theater. Or no, he was shot. He was before the theater, but he was shot and killed. There were 3 people shot that day. 2 died. But in most of the accounts you will read about the assassination, including in very respectable history books, they won't always mention that Connolly or Tippit were shot. Tippit was killed. Does that mean they're in contradiction? No. It just means that the author mentioning what happened that day focused on a particular set of details. What's clearly the most important detail that Tippit was shot and killed, that Connolly was wounded, or that the President of the United States was assassinated? Every account edits things down, including the biblical accounts, as we saw at the end of John. You know, if I wrote down all the things that Jesus had done, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to fill all the accounts. So he's admitting this is an edited down version. And the other biblical accounts are the same way. They very selectively picked the stories and put them together to form the Gospels. And so Matthew, giving the details, mentions there were 2 people there. Luke only mentioned the most important one. It does not make Luke wrong. It just means Luke didn't bother to mention that. He probably also didn't mention neither of them mentioned the seller of goods across in the stall, or the people that were passing by on the street, or the fact that there was a donkey over there, or all the other various possible details that were, if you were to take a picture of that event and you were to start looking at all the various things. Like her mother loves the movie Scrooge, right, with Albert Finney, the musical version. And she watches that every year at Christmas time. And every year at Christmas time, she sees something she'd never seen before. Some little detail in a shop window or something over there. It's just the way we are. We selectively bring down things It's how we look at stuff. That's why when you have an account of, one of the things that police officers do when they are interviewing two suspects, they think they committed a crime, they start interviewing them. What do they look for? They look for differences in their stories, right? They also look for similarities in their stories. Because if the accounts are too similar, if they all are saying exactly the same thing, then it means they're probably telling a lie and they had coordinated on what they were supposed to say beforehand. So, if we were to have all four Gospels, and they all said exactly the same thing, well then, one, why would we need four? Right off the bat. Why do we need four? Well, yeah, they said all exactly the same thing, then, well, they would have gotten together and colluded on the stories. The fact that there are these minor differences is actually indication of their reliability. Because when you look at the minor differences are not contradictions. They're exactly the types of differences you would expect in independent accounts. If I was to walk out of the room and each independently were to say, okay, what did Elgin Wright talk about in the last 15 minutes? Right? If I came in, collected those answers, and looked at them, if they all said the same thing, then I would know you were all talking and sharing answers, and you ended up all coordinating. I would expect there to be some differences, because that's life. And so a lot of the things that are alleged to be contradictions are actually things that strengthen the reliability when put into context. Probably one of the most difficult ones, and we did this when we were in the Gospel of John, was the account in Mark about the crucifixion, where Mark says it was the third hour when they crucified him. And then in John it says, and it was the preparation of the Passover about the 6th hour. And he said unto the Jews, behold, your king, shall I crucify your king? And we went in a lot more detail there then about this, but there's a possibility that this is a textual issue where the writing of the Greek letter, they used letters for numbers, and the Greek letter for 3 and the Greek letter for 6 were very, very similar. One was basically a gamma and a digamma, so they were like that. On the other hand, there's some possibilities. One could be using Roman time, and one could be using Hebrew time. In other words, calendar time that starts, the 6th hour starts at midnight, or the 6 hours, or the first hour, excuse me. First hour starts at midnight, so the 6th hour would be 6 a.m. Or, and then Mark is using a sunup for the first hour, which means the third hour would be 9 a.m. So they would reconcile that way. Both of those would be perfectly legitimate. I actually think the most likely explanation is that their concept of time was vastly different than ours. They didn't have watches. They had sundials. It depended on how you held your... they didn't have the same concept of time. And so to say, if I say I got there at noon, does that mean I got there just in modern concept of time? Does that mean I got there at exactly 12 o'clock and 0 seconds and 0 microseconds and 0 nanoseconds? No. Does it mean I got there exactly 12 o'clock and 0 seconds? No. Does it mean I got there exactly at 12 o'clock and 0 minutes? No. In fact, depending on who you talk to, there'd be a range on what 12 o'clock could actually mean. And it could mean, I got there 10 minutes before, or it could mean I got there 10 minutes after, or it may mean it could be even larger than that depending on the exact context. If I was really, when I say I got there at 12, was I really saying I was there at 12? Because language is very flexible in how we use it. Now, take that modern concept of flexibility in time span and transfer that back to a time span when people usually thought in terms of multiple hours. We usually had only the 3rd hour and the 6th hour. And so Mark could be just saying that the 3rd hour had passed, and John could be saying that the 6th hour had not yet come.
Could it be that 3 hour was when the crucifixion began, and the 6th hour when he died?
Except that if you read here, it says, in his preparation for the Passover, it was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Pilate, behold your king. So this is still when we're at Pilate. So the exact time frames, we don't think commonly in terms of hours. The 3rd hour, the 6th hour. So, but any of those solutions will fit. And this is about as severe as it gets when it comes to contradictions in the Bible. And those aren't very severe. Now, we brushed over the time frames a little bit. Remember when we went through 1 John, we spent about half an hour going over all those various theories. But there really is there's no problem here. And in fact, it led one scholar, I think it was Craig Bloomberg, he commented on how his liberal counterparts, how they so frequently accept these things as contradictions without actually interacting with the text. And I can't think of her name right at the moment, but there was a philosopher who looked at some of these, not from a biblical point of view, but just from the point of view of philosophy. And she pointed out that these things don't actually qualify as contradictions or even contraries. So when you hear someone say the Bible's full of contradictions, ask them for one. They've given you a sort of representative subset here. And all of these have eminent solutions. Yeah?
Is there a question as to how Judas died?
Oh yeah. And that's one of the other ones that it talks about the tree, and there's explanations there. If I remember correctly, the account in Acts where it talks about him falling, and the possible explanation there is that he was hung, and no one bothered to cut down the body, and after a while it fell. And the description in Acts is basically describing what happened when that occurred. So there's no sign of internal contradiction, right? There's lots and lots of claims, but when we look at the text in context, with an understanding of the relevant histories and languages and everything going on, there's no contradictions in the Bible. Still doesn't necessarily mean it's true. One could argue there's no contradictions in the Lord of the Rings, but there's no, I'm not sure we could argue that one way or the other, but let's say you could, for example, that wouldn't make the story in the Lord of the Rings true. So the fact that there's no contradictions it removes an argument of the critics, but it doesn't still answer the question as to whether the text itself is correct. But that's not where the internal evidence ends. In fact, a lot of the internal evidence is looking at things after that. Now, some of the stuff we've already looked at in terms of higher criticism, we addressed the issue of dates, the dates of the manuscripts, things like that. One of the big trends that we've seen over the years is that the dates, particularly of the New Testament, have been pushed earlier and earlier and earlier. The ideas within, the late part of the 19th century was that the New Testament was written very late, largely in the 2nd century. Gospel of John, for example, dates went as late as 170 AD for the Gospel of John being written, at least up until the time they actually found fragments of the Gospel of John that dated from no later than 130 and probably a little earlier than that. So by about the middle of the 20th century, the dates for virtually all the New Testament had been pushed to the 1st century, and the trend has been to put it earlier and earlier and earlier. Even a lot of things that were initially started out like redaction criticism, where you try to find the various forms, and they started out as being overtly hostile, has actually ended up strengthening our understanding of how early the accounts are. So it now appears that all the New Testament was written within the time frame that we would commonly think is the traditional time frame. In fact, if anything, the dates are moving even earlier. They'll have that. I was hoping they would release the findings on the 1st century Gospel of Mark during the class, but they got only 2 more weeks to do that, so not sure that's going to happen during the class, but they got some reputed finding. I actually think, if you want my dates, I actually believe that the Gospel of Matthew was written first, that it was written sometime in the late 30s or early 40s, that we know some of the letters of Paul were written starting around late 40s or very early 50s. Thessalonians, one of the things that I noticed, you notice 2 Thessalonians in its description of the second coming, very, very similar, a lot of verbal literary connections to Matthew. Nothing quoted, but if you read Matthew's statement about the end times and you read 2 Thessalonians, you'll notice stark parallels between them. So I believe Paul knew of Matthew's gospel and had it before he wrote Thessalonians. So I believe Paul's letters were all written by Paul. In fact, virtually all scholars do, except for the letters of Timothy. That is, Paul went on a 2nd missionary journey to Spain. Excuse me, a 3rd missionary journey to Spain. Came back from Spain, was arrested a 2nd time, was put in prison. That's where he wrote the letters to Timothy. I believe he also wrote Hebrews during that time, which we will see starting next year. And he wrote them with the assistance of Luke. So all the letters seem to be written, at least the vast majority of them, good evidence are written within the time frame. So that is pretty much, there's no problems there. Then we come to style. And one of the interesting things about the New Testament is it represents a distinct Hebrew style, which, particularly when you're the closer you get to the words of Jesus, the more the Greek reflects a Hebrew style to it. Now, if you're sitting down and you're going to write something in Greek, you just tend to write it out. The fact that the New Testament has a lot of these indicators that point to a Hebrew or an Aramaic core is a sign of its authenticity. Because what language did Jesus teach in? Aramaic and Hebrew. Probably some Greek depending on the location, but for the most part it would have been Aramaic. And so when the writers of the New Testament started talking about what Jesus had done, a lot of that filtered into their translations. So, for example, Matthew 28:18. Now, some of this, by the way, has been smoothed over in modern translations. But so if you go to, I'm not sure this is going to be in the NIV, but if you go to, for example, the NASB, or something that's a little bit more literal, you'll see, for example, in Matthew 28:18, and Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying. And spoke, saying? Seems a little repetitive, doesn't it? And he spoke to them, saying. You don't see that sort of thing in Greek, but it's very, very common in Hebrew. And so when we see that in a Greek text, it's implying that this came from a Hebrew origin. And there are literally tons of these things out there. I mean, there's scholars have gone over this, and they've shown all the indicators. And when we look at these, it's indicating that these accounts came from a first century Hebrew setting, and they were only written down in Greek. Finally, there's the concept that's called dissimilarity, which is just sort of a fancy scholarly term for what you would not normally expect to find. You're going to write an account of the God of the universe who became a man and lived among us. Right? Forget, for example, it's hard for Christians to do this because they're so deep in the New Testament that they immediately go to the New Testament. For a minute, stop. Forget the New Testament as best you can and think, I'm going to write the story of God coming to earth and doing what? What would you expect? Hollywood's going to put this on a big major movie. Lots of special effects, right? All sorts of wonderful things happening. There's just what you would expect to find. Is that what we see in the New Testament? No. Not at all. In fact, go to Mark 14:36. Mark 14:36. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father. He said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Is that the God of the universe? Is that what we expect to see from him? No, we expect him to rise up and smote his enemies, right? That's what always happens in the last reel. The end of the movie, the hero is basically been destroyed, and then suddenly he seems to summon some power and rise up and defeat the bad guy. No, he was crucified. Not only that, even in the writing here, to a Jewish mind, that he would say, Abba, Father. virtually blasphemous. It was blasphemous. In fact, a lot of what he said was blasphemous from a Jewish mind. So here you're writing an account trying to say you should follow this man. And yet you're putting all these offensive things in there. And you're saying, yeah, and he died a criminal's death. And of course, you're making the story up, and you're in the story because you're Peter, right? So you're making up this story as you go along, and you're just saying, I think I'm going to betray him and run off as a coward. If you're able to invent the story however you want, are you going to have yourself, I want you to, but it was only me who stood with him at the end, right? I stood with him to the very end. I fought there. Or you're going to have him, no, I actually denied him to a servant girl because, I was too afraid. These are things you would not expect to find in an account that was made up. These are not things you would expect, but they're there. Just like when you read in little telltale signs, like in the account of Mark, where Peter goes to the fire just before he does betray Jesus. And he talks about how the night was cold and how the fire was warm. About the embers. Little teeny details that don't say a whole lot, but they do give this air of authenticity. So this is the concept of dissimilarity. So in conclusion, scholar Rene, I'm probably going to butcher this name very badly, Latruelle, in surveying the scholar results and found as authentic the linguistic, social, political, economic, cultural, and religious environment depicted. The great events of Jesus' life, the baptism, the temptation, the transfiguration, the teachings on the kingdom, the call to repentance, the parables, beatitudes, the teaching on God as Father, the miracles and the exorcisms, the sign of the kingdom, betrayal, the agony, trial, crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, the controversies with the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus' attitudes of simplicity and authority, of purity and compassion, the Christology implied by the signs of Jonah, the signs of the temple, and the Son of Man title, the rejections of space-time boundaries of the kingdom, and the call of mission of the apostles, coupled with their initial enthusiasm, subsequent lack of understanding, and final betrayal and desertion. These are the parts that tools and things like dissimilarity show to be accurate. It's a little bit of the New Testament, isn't it? This, by the way, we'll close on somewhat of a controversial note here. Like I said, I believe in inerrancy. But when I'm talking to critics, I never talk about inerrancy unless they insist. And then I usually only talk about it to get them to talk about something else. Because inerrancy is a theological position, ultimately. I believe the Bible to be inerrant because of theological reasons about God and, I do, however, believe, and I will talk to critics, about reliability. Because when I talk about reliability, I have taken the burden. So if I say the Bible is inerrant, and I want to demonstrate that, then I have to say that I have to be able to show that every single thing the Bible says is correct. And I believe everything it does say is correct, but I don't know if I can actually demonstrate everything it says is correct. For example, can I demonstrate that its descriptions of heaven are accurate? Or its descriptions of hell are accurate? No, I didn't quite take those pictures on my last vacation. Right? So I talk about reliability. Because if I talk about reliability, the burden on me is very easy. I can show that it's reliable. But also, there's a burden on those who disagree. Because they have to show it's unreliable. Because there's lots of evidence that shows it's reliable. They have to counter that with some evidence on their own. And let's say you're talking to somebody and they're saying, you know, that third hour and 6th hour thing, I just can't get past that. That's got to be wrong. I don't care about what any of your explanations. That's just got to be wrong. I'll say, okay, well, that they may have messed up on the hour of crucifixion. Does that really affect the crucifixion? Does it affect anything else? And I said my publisher does not believe in inerrancy. He doesn't believe in inerrancy for this reason. Because he doesn't want to get in these little battles about the 3rd and 6th hour. He wants to talk about the gospel. He wants to talk about things he can definitely show. Because think about this list: the linguistic, social, political, economic, cultural, religious environment, the great events of Jesus' life, the baptism, temptation, transfiguration, teaching of the kingdom, call to repentance, parables, beatitudes, teachings on God the Father, miracles, exorcisms, signs of the kingdoms, betrayal, agony, trial, crucifixion, burial, resurrection, controversies with the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus' attitude of simplicity and authority and the purity and compassion, Christology implied by the signs of Jonah, the signs of the temple, the Son of Man, the rejection of space-time boundary kingdoms, and the calling and mission of the apostles, coupled with their initial enthusiasm, subsequent lack of understanding, final betrayal, and desertion. That's the part that can be firmly established. And I would argue that's far more important than was it the 3rd or the 6th hour? Even though I don't even think that's an error. But if I'm going to be talking to someone who needs to hear the gospel, I want to spend my time talking about the gospel, not what time of day it was. Because you know what? If I ultimately win and I convince them that there's no problem with the 3rd or the 6th hour, what have I got? Nowhere. If I spend my time talking about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and what that means in your life, then I'm getting someplace. And so I want to focus on those things. And again, this goes back to my view of apologetics of removing bricks off the wall. If a person's got a brick there about the 3rd and the 6th hour, then I'm going to spend time and I'm going to help get past that brick. Because if that's a stumbling block, then I want to get that stumbling block out of the way. But I don't want to be putting bricks up on the wall. Saying, well, you gotta believe this and this and this and this and this, and then we can go talk about the gospel. I think that's somewhat backwards. So, we end this with, the Bible is reliable. And we kind of went a little bit long today. That leaves us essentially one part left, which is inspiration. Is it really the inspired Word of God? And that is where we will pick up next week. So, we will maybe, in theory, possibly finish the structured part of the class next week. If so, begin thinking about, we may not, I wouldn't be surprised if we ran over, but think about, if we do, think about, is there any passages in the Bible that have troubled you? Or now that we've gone through all of this, is there any particular questions you would like to focus on in the last week? So if we have time, if we wrap up next week, we will go into what is actually the Bible study part. And I have some stuff we can go through in that. But Other than that, I'd rather do, if you have it, take special sort of directed studies. So if you got a particular issue or something you want to cover, we can do that.